Page 38 continued. While the peasants under the Donis and Kshetra Swamins were reduced to a servile position, the free peasants lost in status because of the imposition of several new taxes which can be compared to feudal dues in Europe. It seems that during the Gupta period, the villagers had to pay forced contributions of money or supplies to royal troops and officials when they halted at or passed through the village, 261, which can be likened to the tax known as Sena Bhakta in the Arthashastra of Kautilya, 262. Further, they had to furnish cattle in relays for transport, 263. They were also under the obligation of supplying flowers and milk to the royal officers on tour, 264. These forced contributions were designed to meet the needs of the army and the state. The practice of realizing contributions which were not sent to the state treasury but were consumed locally by royal troops and officers tended to set them up as another class of intermediaries and thus to lower the position of the free peasantry. Para. The incidence of labor services and forced contributions would not be much felt under the direct jurisdiction of the royal representatives who were mobile and not hereditary, but it could be rendered oppressive by the Donis who were men on the spot with a hereditary vested interest in the exploitation of the resources of the village. This kind of labor service reminds us of the European feudal practice, according to which the tenants had to carry out two obligations: one, payment of rents, and two, furnishing labor services for cultivation of the portion of land reserved for direct farming by the master, 265. In Gupta and post-Gupta times, these obligations were performed towards the Donis in central and western India, but the practice was hardly different from what we find in Europe. Para. The judicial and administrative authority which the Donis enjoyed must have added to their economic power over the inhabitants of the village. Hence, in some respects, the beneficiaries of grants may be compared to the feudal lords of the manors, but in other respects the position was different. Probably those who were subjected to forced labor were not compelled to work on the fields of the grantees to the same extent as peasants in medieval European manors. Furthermore, the area of land under the direct cultivation of the grantee was limited, for we hardly hear of the grant of more than a village at a time to the Brahmanas, 266. Consequently, there was little occasion for such work and its scope was probably restricted. Page 40. Para. What mainly led to the servitude of the peasants was their transfer to the beneficiaries. Fahian clearly states that monasteries built for the monks were furnished with houses, gardens, and fields with husbandmen and cattle to cultivate them, 267. But the earliest epigraphic reference to the transfer of peasants to a monastery is not older than the 7th century. The Ashrafpur grants from East Bengal mention the persons who were in the enjoyment of a plot, 268, and name the cultivators who were tilling it, 269. They indicate that while the plot was taken away from the enjoyers and given to the Buddhist monastery, headed by the preceptor Sanghamitra, the cultivators were left undisturbed, for the monastery would have to get its land cultivated by some peasants. They also show that another field cultivated by two persons was given to the same recipient, 270, para. According to the epigraphs, the practice of transferring peasants began in South India. A Pallava land grant of the 3rd-4th century informs us that 4 sharecroppers remained attached to a plot of land which was given away to the Brahmanas, 271, which implies that original cultivators were required to work on the land even when it was made over to the beneficiary. Again, a Prakrit grant of the Salankayana Vijaya Deva Varman from Ellore in the Godavari district records an endowment to a Brahmana of 20 Nivartanas of land, together with a house-site, S-I-T-E. Within bracket, Gharathanam, for men who receive half the crop, and a house site for the doorkeeper or the guard, 272. These 2 instances suggest that the sharecroppers and laborers who were attached to the fields were compelled to stick to them. Gradually, the practice came to embrace peasants who seem to have been given away to the Donis in Karnataka. A grant of the 6th century from the Bijapur district, 273, issued by an early Chalukya king of Badami, donates 25 Nivartanas of land along with all its produce, garden cultivation, jiraka water, and house, Nivesha, 274. Apparently, the term Nivesha stands here for cottages in which the peasants lived. This is supported by a Ganga grant of about the same century from the Ganjam district, 275. It states that 6 halas of land along with 4 cottages, Chatur Niveshana Sahita, were constituted into an agrahara and granted free of taxes in perpetuity to God Narayana, 276, page 41. In both the grants, the term Nivesha or Niveshana is used not merely in the sense of house or house site, but in the sense of peasants living therein, as is still done in popular parlance in the countryside. From South India, the practice of the transfer of individual peasants probably spread to Central India. A Vakataka grant of the 5th century speaks of the gift of 4 houses meant for the use of cultivators, Karshaka Niveshanani, 277, which implies the making over of cultivators to the beneficiary. Para. The practice of transferring all the cultivators of the village to the beneficiary can be traced back to the 6th century AD in Orissa and the adjacent areas of central India. An inscription from the Koraput district assignable to that century, 278, advises the inhabitants of a village cultivating land therein and assured of their livelihood to continue to live in the village which is made over to the Brahmanas, 279. This implies that the cultivators are counseled to stick to the soil transferred to the recipient, although the fact that the village is transferred along with its inhabitants is not stated in so many words in the grant. Again, grants from the eastern part of central India ask the cultivators residing in the donated villages to pay taxes to the beneficiaries, carry out their orders, and to live in happiness, 280. The term, quote, in happiness, unquote, sounds a little incongruous in the context of the fiscal and administrative privileges with which the beneficiaries were armed, but the whole instruction implies that the people were advised to stick to their village. These pious sermons, however, did not always work, and hence an element of coercion had to be introduced in those areas where it was necessary to retain the services of artisans and peasants. Para. The charters of the Maitrakas and Chalukyas of Gujarat imply the transfer of peasants along with the soil. The earliest instance can be referred to the second half of the 6th century when the Vallavi ruler Dharasena II records the gift of plots of varying size held by 5 persons, one of whom is called Mahattara and another Kutumbin, 281. Probably along with the plots, their holders changed hands, otherwise there was no point in mentioning their names. Again, a charter of the Pallavi ruler Dharasena III, dated AD 623-24, grants 4 plots of cultivated land of varying size, held respectively by 4 cultivators or kutumbins, who are named in the grant. Page 42. These fields were well defined and lay in the midst of plots held by other peasants, 282, among whom an element of serfdom was introduced. That the peasants attached to the soil were transferred can also be inferred from the Navsari plates of an early Gurjara ruler of Gujarat, Jayabhata III, AD 706. This king bestowed a large field of 64 nivartanas on a brahmana along with its houses and its immovable and movable property, Grihastavara-Chalaka, 283, which suggests that the householders living on this field were also made over along with the portions of land. The 3 instances concern the gift of fields and not of villages. The earliest grant which unequivocally transfers the villages to the grantee is that of a feudatory ruler called the Maharaja Samudra Sena, ascribable to the 7th century AD 284. According to it, a village in the Kangra area is made over to the grantee with its inhabitants, sa-prativasi-jana-sameta, stop, 285. Thus, some parts of Kangra and Gujarat experienced serfdom during the 6th and 7th centuries. Para. Serfdom seems to have been a feature of the transfer of those pieces of land which did not form part of organized villages but were held independently by peasant families having their habitation not in a cluster of dwellings but in isolated houses. In such a case, all the land the peasant cultivated lay round his house. When it was donated, peasants working on it had to be retained, otherwise the donee would be put to a great difficulty. Some of these peasants were probably ploughmen cultivating for the sake of the donor. It is therefore possible to think of 2 kinds of serfs, those who possibly served as ploughmen and those who served as tenants living in villages. The latter paid a part of their produce as rent and fulfilled the obligations laid down in the charter. In the Indian context, the ploughmen attached to the ground should be regarded as full-fledged serfs, while the tenants specifically transferred along with the villagers may be taken as semi-serfs. The latter did not have to work on the private farms of the beneficiaries, although under difficult economic situations they could not leave the village to seek means of subsistence elsewhere. Para. Epigraphic records suggest that serfdom began in the peripheral areas and then gradually spread to the heart of the country in northern India. Page 43. It originated in mountainous or backward regions which did not have too many peasants to run the local economy, but because of the powers it gave to the grantees over the cultivators, it later spread to developed areas. It began with the sharecroppers and then it covered the peasants in general. Finally, it began with plots of land and then it came to embrace whole villages. By the middle of the 8th century, serfdom became fairly common, as is attested by the following extracts from a Chinese account of AD 732 footnote 286, quote, according to the law of the 5 Indies, F capital, Indies I capital, INDIES, from the king, the royal consort and the princes down to the chiefs and their wives all built monasteries separately in accordance with their respective capacities and abilities. Each of them builds his own temple, but does not construct it jointly. They say when each person has one's own meritorious virtues, what is the necessity of joint effort? Unquote. Para. Beg your pardon, it's not unquote, it continues. Para. Whenever a monastery is built, village and its folk are immediately offered to support the capital T 3 precious P capital ones O capital Merely building a monastery without making any donation of a village and its folk is not done. This is followed as an example by the foreign countries. The king, the queen and royal consorts have their respective village and their folk. The princes and chiefs also have their respective village and their folk. Donation is free and the king is not asked for that. This also applied in case of building a temple. When it is necessary to build a temple, they build it and the king is not asked. The king dare not obstruct, He is afraid lest it should infect him with sins. Para. As to rich commoners, though they have no village to donate, they try their best to build temples and manage these by themselves. Whenever they obtain things, they offer them to the 3 precious ones. As in the 5 Indies, no human being is sold, so there are no female slaves. Villages and their inhabitants could be donated if wanted and necessary. Unquote. Para. The present account shows that the practice of donating villages along with their inhabitants to the monasteries of kings, queens, princes, and chiefs was as common as that of building them by these dignitaries. There was no dearth of donations because not only the kings and queens but also the princes and chiefs possessed their own villages and village folk whom they could dispose of freely. Princes and lesser chiefs probably received grants for their maintenance from their superior lord, but were apparently free, page 44, to make a religious gift of their land with the men working on it. Obviously, the inhabitants were bound to serve the donors as long as they lived under them and to serve the beneficiaries when they were transferred to the latter.